On 24 February 2022, Russia declared war and launched a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine. Since then, Russian missiles rained down throughout Ukraine, causing displacement, suffering, and deaths, including those of civilians and children. After the 2014 annexation of Crimea, Putin has been backing pro-separatist movements in Ukraine, warning or rather threatening the pro-NATO, pro-EU oriented government, and militarily approaching the Ukrainian border, preparing for war. What is the full context of the invasion, its geopolitical, legal, and humanitarian consequences, motives, and possible conclusions? While at this moment, debating why something happened and how it could have been avoided seems a privilege of those not in the midst of conflict, it is crucial we discuss these issues to understand how tragedies like this one can be avoided in the future and to apply the lessons to help the victims. To help with that today, I'm speaking with Professor Richard Falk. Professor Falk is an expert in international law. He's a professor emeritus at Princeton and a visiting distinguished professor in global and international studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. One of his many roles includes the 2008 six-year appointment as a United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. He is an author, co-author, and editor of some 50 books, truly a person of immeasurable knowledge and experience. Professor Falk, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, very happy to be here and hope we have a good conversation.
So firstly, could you explain how this invasion violates international law and is it a crime of aggression? What are the key legal aspects that we need to understand?
Well, I think this is a very clear example of violating the most basic norm of contemporary international law, which is that no use of force across an international boundary is legal unless it's in response to a prior armed attack and can qualify as an act of self-defense. And even then, it needs to be reported to the UN Security Council and obtain approval from the UN. So there's no question that this is a crime of aggressive war, a crime against the peace in the Nuremberg sense, the judgment that was made against Germans after World War II. At the same time, there's an ambiguity that underlies the clarity of international law, and that is the degree to which geopolitical actors are given an exemption from the norms requiring adherence to international law. And this exemption is not a matter of practice, but it was designed, it was embodied in the UN Charter itself in the form of giving the power of veto to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, which of course includes Russia. Therefore, what the veto means is that within the framework of the UN itself, which is supposedly the guarantor of international law, there is an exception made for the most dangerous countries in the world, the most powerful countries in the world. So there's a kind of contradiction between what international law prescribes and what geopolitics allows. There are certain norms in geopolitics that create an ambiguity in this Ukrainian crisis. Because on the one hand, it is a matter of geopolitical practice that the states that qualify as geopolitical actors maintain spheres of influence close to their borders. And that other geopolitical actors respect that sphere of influence. And one can argue that from the Russian point of view, that was not really respected. And the Russian interests in their border regions have not been respected. This involves partly the suggestions that Ukraine might become a member of NATO, which has always been a kind of alliance directed at Russia, previously at the Soviet Union, and also that there were signs that the US in particular intervened in 2014 in the elections taking place in the Ukraine and making sure that a anti-Russian, pro-Western leader was selected. So you have that kind of geopolitical norm that complicates a perception of these events from a world order perspective. And one further final small point, after World War II, when the German and Japanese leaders were prosecuted for crimes of aggression, it was a case of victor's justice, because the crimes of the victors were excluded from accountability and scrutiny. So again, that's a kind of geopolitical norm. If you win a war, you can impose justice on the loser, and the winner enjoys impunity. And that's embodied in a certain way in international law itself. So the Nuremberg judgment is considered a major development in international criminal law, but it's a development that makes allowance for geopolitical norms. And one of them is that if you win a war, a big war, you're not going to be held accountable if you commit crimes. And the winners in World War II certainly were subject to investigation, if not indictment, for dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, plus the strategic bombing of entire German cities in ways that were indiscriminate and seemed to be contrary to international law.
As an extension to the victor's justice term, obviously some big players on the international geopolitical scene today, like Germany, India, Japan, are excluded from permanent membership in the UN Security Council because of the consequences of World War II. Is it likely that Russia will lose its seat on the UN Security Council because of this invasion?
I very much doubt it. It would have to be expelled from the UN itself, because part of the UN Charter is to confer this permanent seat and the right of veto on these 5 countries. And to change that requires a decision of the Security Council that is itself subject to the veto. So there's a kind of constitutional impediment to eliminating Russia from its Security Council permanent seat. But in addition to that, one of the achievements of the UN as compared to the League of Nations, which preceded it, is to achieve universality of membership. And whether you agree or not with what a particular government is doing, there have been no efforts, no prior efforts to expel or to diminish the privileges of a UN member, let alone one of the permanent 5, in the whole history of the UN. South Africa was very unpopular in the apartheid period. Israel, in various ways, has been very unpopular at various times. And the Soviet Union, of course, was quite unpopular. The most that was ever done along these lines, and it was proved to be a failure, and the West abandoned the policy was to try to suspend the Soviet voting rights because they refused their funding obligation in relation to peacekeeping operations with which they disagreed. This was in the midst of the Cold War. And as I say, that effort at kind of punitive response didn't succeed and was seen as actually weakening the UN rather than strengthening the norms of payment or funding that were important in that context. And the universality of UN membership is very important. And not only has the UN not expelled any country, but no country has seen it in their interest to leave the UN. Indonesia did for a very brief period in the mid-1960s, but they immediately rejoined afterwards. The Soviet Union actually boycotted the Security Council in the 1950s because of the refusal to replace nationalist China with communist China. And the North Korean invasion of South Korea occurred in 1950. The UN was absent from the Security Council and therefore couldn't veto the Security Council call for a collective defense. Soviets at the time said they would never make that mistake again, and no country has subsequently boycotted the Security Council. So again, one is confronted with a lot of complexity and really ends up with a kind of ambiguous situation where there are no good answers.
Putin has been struggling to find a legitimate casus belli. He's pointed out the hypocrisy of the West, particularly the US, and the expansion of NATO, and we will discuss that more in a minute. But could you comment on the claims regarding genocide and Russia's alleged responsibility to protect ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people in Ukraine?
I think there's very little substance to those claims, especially the claim of genocide seems to me somewhat a hysterical way of characterizing what is undoubtedly a discriminatory policy practiced by the Ukrainian capital on its two Russian majority provinces in the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. There was, to avoid internal conflict, the so-called Minsk agreements reached in 2014-15 that were supposed to create a high measure of self-government and non-discrimination in the relationship between Ukraine as a state and Donbas as a region in the state. But those agreements are generally regarded as having not been complied with by Ukraine. So there is that kind of human rights issue, but it's not an issue that justifies intervention absent a Security Council authorization given to Russia to do so. And that was neither sought, Putin didn't seek that, nor would he have received it had he sought it. But again, that's not out of keeping with the way in which geopolitics is practiced. The Kosovo intervention by NATO in 1999 similarly didn't even seek UN authorization, and yet initiated basically an anti-Serbian war on human rights grounds based on what Serbia was alleged to have done in Bosnia. It was arguably a desirable humanitarian initiative. It also was taken as a way of showing that NATO was still relevant, even though the Cold War was over. And so there were mixed motives, as there often are in these kinds of ambiguous situations. But by and large, the Putin legal and world order humanitarian rationalizations are not of sufficient weight to be taken very seriously.
The West has been moving closer to Ukraine for years now, negotiating for EU and NATO memberships, supporting pro-Western groups, even involvement in, as you mentioned, the ousting of the pro-Russian former President Yanukovych. There are NATO bases in the Baltic countries, in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, none of which were initially meant to be part of the NATO pact. And Putin notices this and claims self-defense because Russia is basically surrounded. And if the situation was reversed, I'm curious how the US would react if Russia came to its backyard with military bases, like, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So how prevalent was NATO's move closer to the Russian border in instigating this conflict?
Well, there's no doubt that NATO and the West and the US in particular were acting to weaken, if not subvert, Russia's claimed sphere of influence around its borders, particularly, as you suggest, in Eastern Europe, and even more provocatively in the Ukraine. This relates to my earlier comment that from the point of view of geopolitics, what Putin has done, although a humanitarian tragedy for the people of Ukraine, is in accord with geopolitical norms, including the US, which long maintained a so-called Monroe Doctrine for the whole of the Western Hemisphere that warned Europe not to attempt colonization, and also expressed a variety of claims to protect American interests in Latin American countries. And the Cuban Missile Crisis during the Cold War was, in some ways, a dangerous precedent for what's happening now in the Ukraine. And a real catastrophe was only avoided because the two leaders at the time, Kennedy and Khrushchev, acted in a prudent and sensible way, recognizing the mutual interests of the two countries and giving each other room to show its own society that it hadn't surrendered or backed down under pressure. But I'm afraid we don't have that quality of leadership on either side at this point. And there's behavior of the US toward China prior to this Ukrainian crisis indicated a certain desire by the political class in Washington to find a geopolitical pretext for what amounts to a new Cold War. At minimum, a rivalry with other states, both economically, ideologically, and to some extent militarily. So there was an atmosphere of intensifying a great power conflict, which, unlike in the Cold War, was against the background of unmet global challenges, most dramatically those associated with climate change. So it's very costly from a world order perspective to have resources and political energies devoted to this kind of conflict and withdrawn from the ecological hazards that threaten the stability of the whole world.
So we've been speaking about the use of force as a way of accomplishing geopolitical goals. But officially, Putin has basically claimed three main reasons for the invasion: genocide, self-defense, and historical ties to the territory and people of Ukraine. Could we maybe talk a bit more about what geopolitical benefits does Russia have from the invasion?
Well, I think in retrospect, this invasion and attempted interference with the internal political life of Ukraine is one more failure of regime-changing interventions that the Soviet Union experienced in 1979's intervention in Afghanistan. U.S. has experienced a series of setbacks, starting with Vietnam, in Iraq, in Libya. The post-colonial world has evened the balance of power between the militarily superior intervener and the politically persevering nationalism of the society that is the target of intervention. So that where interventions in the pre-World War II context were efficient means of projecting power globally, military superiority no longer controls political outcomes. And Putin miscalculated, in my view, thinking that it would be a cost-efficient way of extending the Russian influence to their, what they call the near abroad, and reestablishing a Russian sphere of influence in the Ukraine. What it has turned into is a multiple crisis of confronting Putin. First, in his own country, unprecedented protests by Russians against a war that they regard as unnecessary and morally wrongful and damaging to Russian claims of political legitimacy. There is no graceful way of achieving an exit from Ukraine. So Putin is confronted with the choices that I'm sure he didn't want of escalating by extending the combat zone or by acknowledging, in effect, the failure of the policy and withdrawing. And the West has played on its side a dangerous game by not giving Putin, I wouldn't say respectable, but a way out, a way to withdraw from the policies without losing his stature as a leader of an important country. I think the West has been unnecessarily provocative and has treated the victimization of Ukraine in a way that hasn't treated other comparable victimizations, such as in Syria, Iraq, and much less the Palestinians, who have suffered from decades of inhumane occupation and unlawful behavior. And the world has done nothing effective to respond. So they're double standards, and they're accentuated by the racist aspect of treating the victims of this Russian aggression differently than the victims of Western aggression. For instance, the Ukrainian refugees are welcomed, whereas Syrian refugees confronted barbed wire and hostility. And one has to remember that the Ukrainians are white Christians by and large, not Islamic, not Muslims, non-Caucasian Muslims, that sends a sort of racist signal to the rest of the world that is a bit unfortunate, understandable, but unfortunate. Ukraine is, of course, part of Europe, but even the treatment of the Slavic refugees and victims of the events following the breakup of Yugoslavia didn't show the kind of empathy that is being displayed now for the Ukrainians.
Now that you've mentioned Yugoslavia, I'm drawing parallels to how much more solidarity and coverage the Yugoslavian wars got in comparison to, for example, Rwanda and the genocide that was happening there in approximately the same time. Could you comment a bit more on Western hypocrisy? There's a lot of intense criticism of the invasion and support for Ukraine from all around the world. And I think rightfully so. Obviously, it's an illegal, unnecessary war. However, we haven't seen nearly as much coverage and compassion to other conflicts that were not happening on European soil and that were undertaken by the US and its allies.
Well, I would only accentuate your point or underscore it that double standards are characteristic of the behavior of large states in relation to the pursuit of their strategic interests. And Ukraine is, in addition to racism as an underlying factor, is highlighted because it's taken as a strategic encounter of great importance, whereas the situation in former Yugoslavia was not seen as strategically vital on the geopolitical chessboard, let's say. And the same with Rwanda. I mean, even more so with Rwanda. I mean, what happened in former Yugoslavia was within the borders of Europe and therefore had a certain prominence as a result of that. If Yugoslavia had been located in the middle of the Pacific, I'm not sure it would have gotten the attention that it did receive. And I'm not sure there would have been the intervention in the Bosnian War or the Kosovo War. So the geopolitical stakes of conflict are very important in shaping a humanitarian response. And if the victims are in a country that is viewed as geopolitically marginal or remote, the response will be very modest or even just rhetorical. But if it's in a core region or touches on core issues, then it could be very prominent and provide a moral justification for the use of force. What is important, I think, for the West, and particularly for the United States, is that it finds a moral justification as well as a legal justification for intervening in an ongoing war. And not that it has committed itself to a full-scale military intervention, but it is supplying weapons directly and indirectly and imposing a very harsh spectrum of sanctions. It's practicing coercive diplomacy in response to Russian aggression and quite openly seeking to inflict pain on Russian society as a way of either punishing or influencing Russian behavior.
Building on that, what should be the role of the international community? As you've mentioned, there are harsh sanctions, travel bans, a freezing of assets, sending military equipment. But if the invasion continues to escalate, Do you think that humanitarian intervention would be justified? And what would be the consequences of the involvement of other countries?
Well, really two questions there. The humanitarian intervention could be morally justified and politically explained, but it would probably be imprudent because of the dangers of escalation, and these dangers threaten to cross the nuclear threshold. So prudence becomes a geopolitical virtue in a situation of this kind. And one would hope that all measures of diplomatic initiative were tempted to de-escalate rather than to go in the opposite direction. As far as the responsibility of the international community is concerned, it's not equipped to address geopolitical infractions of international law, no matter how serious. First, it doesn't have the capabilities. Secondly, it doesn't really have the authority because of the veto power. So you can say in defense of the UN, for instance, that it was never thought to have that role, because otherwise giving the most dangerous countries a veto power would be an obvious contradiction in the peacekeeping, war prevention role that the preamble to the UN Charter declares, but then the Charter itself contradicts. So you have an incoherence, in a certain sense, at the global level. And you can question whether it's really appropriate to use the phrase international community. Community implies shared values. And again, the UN is structured around not only geopolitics, but national interests. The governments don't really act on behalf of the global interest or human interest. They pursue their national interests. A president like Trump made that very clear by his so-called transactional approach to international relations, that the U.S. would only do things internationally if it was serving its national, strategic, and material interests. Of course, the West tries to use the UN in a situation like this as a policy tool to reinforce its legitimacy claims to act aggressively. And it sometimes has worked. The first Iraq War under Saddam Hussein, and next Kuwait, there was a successful use of UN authority to end the aggression and to reverse it. But there was no geopolitical actor directly involved. And at that point, Russia was not opposing the West as it has been doing in more recent years.
In your opinion, is it likely that Russia, if pushed far enough, will use nuclear weapons? And in that case, what would the response of other nuclear countries be? Are we anticipating mutually shared destruction?
Well, it's certainly in the picture. One hopes again that leaders on all sides are not crazy enough to push that possibility closer to reality. And we don't know the mental stability of the leaders of important nuclear weapons states and how they would act under this kind of pressure. And the results of crossing that nuclear threshold would be disastrous in terms of the catastrophic damage, but also in terms of convincing many other countries that they would be much better off having nuclear weapons than not having them. Ukraine had 1,500 nuclear warheads at the time that Soviet Union collapsed in 1992, I think. And if it hadn't given up its nuclear weapons, it's arguable that it would never have been subject to this kind of attack. Libya is the other country that gave up its nuclear capabilities, and it was attacked. And Iraq was attacked. And North Korea has not been attacked. Nuclear weapons, it's another dimension of this double standards. Israel was helped to acquire secretly its nuclear weapons capability and has not been in any way compelled to participate in the non-proliferation regime, for instance. And it's been able to block the obvious solution, for instance, to the Iranian nuclear weapons program would be to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East that included Israel. But the West, and again, particularly the US, is so much under the influence of Israel that it won't even allow that issue to be discussed, much less acted upon.
At the moment, it seems that the resolution for this conflict is going to be either basically rewarding Russia for its war crimes, meaning letting it either annex the regions or get away unpunished with crimes of aggression, or the possibility of involvement of other countries and basically starting a World War III. How do you expect this situation to evolve and eventually end?
Well, first of all, I would question whether Russia will get away with it, even if they do annex Ukraine, which I think they won't do at this stage, but I've been wrong about this before. But these sanctions will be, if anything, intensified, and that will cause great damage to the Russian economy. They will suffer greatly, including the population, maybe especially the population, as a consequence. And those sanctions won't be lifted until the Russians withdraw from Ukraine. So you can expect the best outcome from the Russian point of view, if they continue with their Ukrainian aggression, is to suffer the consequences of a very concerted sanction program carried on for an indefinite period of time. The escalation scenario can only be an invitation to mutual destruction, as you suggest, and also would be a terrible precedent for the future in terms of how countries tried to strengthen their deterrent capabilities. Of course, we never know. History often plays games with our rational assessments. And it may be that there would be enough fear generated that nuclear disarmament would have a new lease of life, so that out of the darkness of this crisis could come the light of a new awakening to the dangers of nuclear weapons.
That's a very positive outlook. I have not thought of that, but very important to put the message out there.
Just say one other thing. One of the tangible positive effects of the Cuban Missile Crisis was to create this mechanism for managing future international crises between the Soviet Union and the West. So there was this kind of effort to avoid miscalculations and accidental forms of confrontation. And that came because of this recognition that the world had come close to going over this nuclear precipice. It's not as far-fetched as it might sound at the moment to think that there would be some positive adjustments made after the smoke clears, so to speak.
Let's hope so. The reason why I proposed that Russia and Putin might get away with being quote unquote unpunished for its crimes is because it seems to be much like the US, their way of conducting their international affairs and furthering their geopolitical interests. For example, the 2008 war in Georgia and the annexation of Crimea in 2014. From the US standpoint, they've been wreaking havoc all around the world, and there's been little to no accountability. That's why I'm pessimistic that Russia would not see consequences of their actions. But to move forward, Professor, since you have so much experience in these subjects, I wanted to ask what worries you the most in this whole situation?
I guess excessively confrontational tactics by the West. I think there's very little that can be done that isn't being done to address the humanitarian catastrophe that faces the Ukrainian people. These catastrophes have occurred in the last 20 years in a variety of countries, and there's been very little successful effort to address them in a humane way. The most that can be done is to contain them, I guess, and to convince the causative actors that their policies are failing. And I think these sanctions have that potential impact, and it's a matter now of finding a political way that makes it attractive to Putin to adopt a more de-escalating set of options. And I hope the West will allow him to do that. See, the West wants this confrontation. You have to put that into the equation, that the West is not unhappy with the geopolitical confrontation. It wanted it for a variety of reasons. In the US case, partly because Biden's domestic program was being frustrated, and only in foreign policy could he get enough political support to pursue an effective national policy based on a degree of unity.
Would you like to offer some concluding notes?
I would only stress again that it's important to distinguish the geopolitical level of discourse from the international law level and from an understanding of the humanitarian tragedy, that those three levels are each very important, but they need to be understood and interpreted in relation to this situation. And what's different about this crisis as compared to, let's say, what was happening in Syria the last decade and Iraq after 2003 is that its locus is in Europe, a fairly substantial country, and the West is still able to dominate the international political discourse and to control controversies over legitimate and illegitimate behavior. See, that's a Western, US-led form of geopolitical primacy. The Russians and the Chinese cannot do that. So that we have a sort of asymmetry at the level of geopolitics. And that's part of the difficulty of this period, where the Chinese and Russians are trying to reestablish spheres of influence, and the US is acting as if it's a global state where the whole world is its sphere of influence.
Professor Falk, thank you so much for blessing us with your opinions and knowledge.
Good to be with you, Nina, and you made me think hard about these issues, and I'm grateful for the experience and wish you well.
Thank you so much. Likewise.